Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special economic weather report brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand. Today we look at net migration figures for November. These are important obviously because the more net migration we have, the more impetus we have to the housing market and to the economy generally. And the numbers for November weren't so good for the economy. They show that permanent departures from New Zealand, obviously two parts of the net figure, people coming in, people leaving. Permanent departures from New Zealand up 25% in November from a year ago. In fact, there were 6,500 or so New Zealanders who left New Zealand to live overseas permanently in November. That's about 215 people a day leaving. And when you look at how it compared with a year ago, it's up by about 1,500 in the month. A large number of those were New Zealanders looking to move to live in Australia. And when you look at what's happening there, about 800 more people left to live in Australia per month this month in November versus a year ago. Now a large chunk of those are New Zealand citizens too, about 2,500. And that's about 83 people a day going to live in Australia. And when you look at the unadjusted numbers, so taking out the seasonality, you can see that there were a net inflow into New Zealand. So obviously some New Zealanders left and there were new New Zealanders arriving, or people who are arriving for a reasonable period. About 1,400 arrived in November, compared with 2,500 a year ago. So even that number is falling. And when you look at net migration for the full year, it's running at about 11,500 a year, down from over 20,000 a year ago. So the impetus to the economy from net migration is shrivelling up. And also when you look up the makeup of that migration, it's not so good for the economy. Mostly the migrants coming to New Zealand are Indian students, about 6,300 in the year to November. That's above the number coming from the UK of about 5,500. And when you look at this chart here, which looks at the annual migration rate of New Zealanders to Australia, you can see going back to 2001, we saw a big number of people coming back. So obviously the further the chart goes down, the worse the migration. And you can see that from about 2003 to the end of 2008, New Zealand's net migration to Australia was increasing as more people went overseas to Australia for a better income. Then we saw it improve through 2009, perhaps because they saw some better outlook for the New Zealand economy and because Australia was struggling a bit. But it's certainly turned around again in the last 6 months or so. People are seeing wages, the gap between Australian wages and New Zealand wages rising again, and obviously the unemployment rate is lower in Australia and things are picking up with the mining boom there. So the gap between Australian wages and New Zealand wages is rising. The exodus of New Zealanders, often trained here to Australia, is increasing, and we risk hollowing out our economy. We have lots of older people who are retiring and about to take on the pension and increase their healthcare costs, a few young people, quite a few new migrants, but that core of New Zealand educated people who have been here for a long time in their most productive years, the 20s, 30s and 40s, they are tending not to live in New Zealand anymore, and they're living overseas, particularly Australia. That is a danger for the economy long term as we hollow out the most productive and taxable part of the workforce and leave in place younger, older and less productive people in the middle. That's a real public policy challenge for the New Zealand government. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a special economic weather report brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand.